Please be seated. The court is now in session. And before we hand the floor to the international co-prosecutor, Ms. Chakraborty, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceedings? Do we have any translation issues? There seems to have no translation output. Can you check the court officer?
សូមគោរពលោកប្រធានសម្រាប់សកម្មភាពថ្ងៃនេះកលាមជីក៏សម្គាល់ឃើញថាគ្រប់ភាគីទាំងអស់នៃរឿងក្តីនេះមានវត្តមានដោយឡែកលោកនួនជាមានវត្តមាននៅបន្ទប់ឃុំខ្លួនខាងក្រោមសាលសកម្មភាពនេះដោយលោកស្នើសុំលះបង់សិទ្ធិមានវត្តមានដោយផ្ទាល់ពីបន្ទប់សកម្មភាពលិខិតលះបង់សិទ្ធិ
President de Greffier Chakraborty, please report the attendance of the parties. Chakraborty, for today's proceedings, all parties to discuss are present. As for Nunchi, he is present in the holding cell downstairs. As he verifies that is present in the courtroom, his waiver has been delivered to the greffier. The expert, Ms. Elizabeth Becker, is present in the courtroom. Thank you. President, thank you, Ms. Chakraborty. The Chamber will now decide on the request by Nuon Chea. The Chamber has received a waiver from Nuon Chea not to present in the main courtroom. It is dated 10 February 2015. He states that due to his health condition, that is back pain, dizziness, and cannot concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in the future hearings, he requests to waive his rights to participate in and be present at the 10th February 2015 hearing. Nuon Chea has been informed by his counsel about the consequence of this waiver, that it is in no way be construed as a waiver of his rights to be tried fairly or to challenge evidence presented or admitted to this court at any time during his trial. The Chamber also has seen the medical report by the Duty Counsel at the ECCC, dated 10 February 2015, who notes that the health condition of Nuon Chea remains unchanged, but he feels dizzy, he has backache and cannot sit for long. Therefore, he recommends that the Chamber shall allow Nuon Chea to follow the proceedings from a holding cell downstairs. Based on this information, and in pursuant to Internal Rule 84.5, the Chamber grants Nuon Chea's request to follow the proceedings from the holding cell downstairs via an audio-visual means for today's proceedings. As he waives his right to be present in the main courtroom, the AV unit joint status to link the proceedings to the holding cells downstairs so that Nuon Chea can follow the proceedings, and that applies for today's proceedings. The Chamber will now hand the floor to the International Co-Prosecutor to put further questions to this expert. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning. Good morning, Your Honors, and good morning, Ms. Becker. I'd like to begin by asking you to look again at a document that Judge Laverne had you look at, and that is E333.1. That could be, please, Your Honor, Mr. President, may the witness be given a copy of that.
Yes, you can do so.
Ms. Becker, I believe yesterday you said you had seen this document some years ago and were familiar with it. In the second paragraph, you recall it says the American journalists, especially the woman, mostly photographed what was bad, such as children working at the traditional medicine-producing office in Kampong Cham, naked children, children walking in lines from the white rice paddy, wearing ragged clothes. Does this refresh your recollection about the document we're talking about?
Yes.
And I'd like to focus on a couple other points. First, the fourth paragraph of that document. In the document, in the fourth paragraph, going down 5 lines, it says that the British professor asked about, and perhaps just so that my pronunciation does not distort anything, I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Seng Leng, to pronounce the 2 names.
Chao Seng.
It's Chao Seng and Pork Chai.
Ms. Becker, did you know either of these individuals?
I don't believe so, no. I think they are the students, aren't they?
No, perhaps this will trigger your memory. If not, again, anytime you're not sure of something or don't know the answer, just say so. But there is a document on the case file, Your Honors, and that is E3-1340, which is a statement of Mr. Chow Seng. It lists him as a member of Parliament of the of Funk Coalition and Special Envoy to Europe of the Cambodian Head of State. Were you familiar with the man with that title? And that is dated the 30th of April, 1975, that document.
No.
Your Honors, do you recall, Ms. Becker, Mr. Caldwell asking about these individuals?
No.
For the record, Your Honor, I would like to just draw everyone's attention to some other documents on the case file, and that is D-120, English ERN 00242931, and D-88, English ERN 001956005. And these are statements by Doik to the Office of Co-Investigating Judges, where he described how Chow Seng was arrested per instructions from Sun Sen and Nun Chia. And I would like to also mention E3-1878, which is the S-21 confession of Pope Che, alias Tuch, and D-108/2686, the English ERN 00873461. It's entitled, it's an S from S-21, entitled Names of Prisoners Smashed on 6 July 1977. And Pope Che, alias Touch, is number 123 on that list, which is dated 14 March 1977. Do you recall during your trip if any of the individuals you asked about, you were told that they'd been arrested or had been told that they had been killed?
No, we were never told if anyone had been arrested or killed or had died.
Now, turning to paragraph 6 on page 4 of that document, the second sentence or second subsection of paragraph 6 indicates the two American journalists clearly serve the American government and the CIA as we have precisely identified. Ms. Becker, did anyone during that trip accuse you of being a member of the CIA? Or serving the CIA?
No.
Now, it is a fact, is it not, that you had previously written quite critically about the American role in the war in Cambodia?
Yes.
Mr. Dudman, who is the other American journalist on the trip, had also written very critically about the American role in the wars in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, and particularly in Cambodia. Is that correct?
Madam Expert, please wait. And Councillor Kong Sam On, you have the floor. Kong Sam On, thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to object the question put forward by the co-prosecutor that he should rely upon a precise article or documents that he referred to in his questioning. Thank you.
Mr. President, I'm happy to adopt the suggestion of counsel. Ms. Becker, Mr. Dudman in particular had written a small book, 40 Days with the Enemy, which he published in 1971, discussing a period of captivity where he was held for about, 40 days. He was held for 40 days by opponents of the Lon Nol regime, and actually, if you read the book, they were Vietnamese forces with Khmer Rouge cadres included. Is that correct? That he had written that book? If there's any part of that that you're not sure of, explain.
No, yes. And I've read the book, and yes.
And how would you describe how the book treats the American involvement in Cambodia, the American military invasion at that time of Cambodia?
I would say that Richard Dudman criticizes the U.S. involvement in the war in Cambodia as a continuation of the mistakes made by being involved in the war in Vietnam.
And just a bit more then on this, as we're talking about Mr. Dudman and your own background, I want to talk a little bit more about your selections for this trip. The Washington Post, which you worked for then, how would that be described in the hierarchy of American newspapers at that time?
It was definitely one of the most important newspapers. It was just the Watergate. It was the newspaper of Watergate, and the Watergate investigations led to the resignation of President Nixon. It is the paper of the capital of the United States, and under publisher Katharine Graham and editor Ben Bradley, it rose to the top ranks.
Mr. Dudman at that time worked for another newspaper out of St. Louis, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
And how would you describe that newspaper as far as the many newspapers that appear in the United States, about how it would rank, if you know?
It's a very good regional newspaper. It is not a national newspaper. Richard Dudman, because of his long service in Washington, writing about American foreign policy, had a profile higher than the newspaper.
Thank you. Now, Malcolm Caldwell, in your book, at page 420, the English urn is 00238133. In French, it's at page 409. French are in 006386669. And in Khmer, page 556, 00232554, you wrote, Caldwell saw himself as a friend of all poor revolutionaries, Vietnamese, Thai, and Cambodian.
President, I think there is a technical issue with the interpretation system. Court officer, could you check it with the ITU? President, the International Court Prosecutor, you may continue. And please repeat your last question, since there was no interpretation. And please be reminded that when you refer to a document number or ER number, please do it slowly, and if possible, do it twice. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Becker, I'm going to read a very short sentence that you wrote in your book, When the War Was Over. That's E3/20. And it appears at page 420 in English, the English ERN 00238133. In French, it appears at page 409, and the ERN is 00638669. In Khmer, it appears on page 556. The ERN is, 00232554. You wrote, Caldwell saw himself as a friend of all poor revolutionaries, Vietnamese, Thai, and Cambodian, and he was extremely upset at the prospect of war between Cambodia and Vietnam. Is that what you wrote about the man who was killed the last night of your visit?
Yes.
At that time of your visit, late 1978, was there one country that was an ally, an absolutely critical ally to any military prospects for Cambodia in any potential conflict with Vietnam?
Yes, China.
Were there Chinese in Phnom Penh, to your knowledge, at the time of your visit?
Yes, in fact, as I said, the only way to come to Cambodia is through China. We came on a Chinese airline, and the majority of the people in the plane were Chinese. The Chinese embassy was large. The Chinese presence was palpable.
In your understanding of the situation, would anything that disrupted relations between China and Cambodia, such as the murder of a Chinese official in Phnom Penh, have been very damaging to Cambodia's military prospects?
That's a little hypothetical. I can't answer that.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. I don't want you to speculate.
President Defense Counsel, Kong Som-on, you have the floor. Kong Som-on, in fact, I wanted to object to the question, but the expert already replied. Thank you. Thank you, and the International Court Prosecutor, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would point out the witness is an expert, so I am allowed to ask her to draw inferences and opinions from facts. But I appreciate that if she's unable to do so, she should not. If she's, let me move on. I'd like you to look at I don't know if we have a copy of the notes that you took during your trip. That's E31171. Mr. President, could we have the witness have an opportunity to review her notes? I have a copy if she needs one.
Yes, you can proceed with that.
So, Ms. Becker, this is E31171. I'm going to ask you about something that appears in English at ERN, and you'll see these numbers stamped from the top left. Top left, it should be stamped 0087871. In Khmer, the ERN is 00726621. And in French, the ERN is 00764046. Just for context, you may look at the preceding page, but is it correct, looking at this page, that is ERN that ends in 871, you're discussing your visit to the 6th January dam?
Oh, yes.
And it appears, is it correct that here you're repeating some information that you were told in the first paragraph? Is that correct?
Yes.
Who was telling you this? Do you recall?
On the next page, I write, the cadre speaking was Mitt Comrade Chi, who's 26 years old. That would be on your 871.
So on page 871, in the page that appears that you have numbered 7 just above it, or 17, it seems to be cut off in my copy. The sentence, the third line down, it indicates I'll read it and you tell me if it's correct, took 2,000 people to build Watergate, 20,000 people to build dikes and canals. Have I interpreted your shorthand correctly? Is that what you wrote?
Yes.
Now, when you visited the site, was work still going on?
Yes, repair work.
Going down to the second to last paragraph, again, I'll try to read your shorthand. You wrote, when I went to take pictures, a picture of soldiers at the Watergate, they ran away, taking their arms. Cadre refused to acknowledge there were soldiers, much less how many or why they were needed to guard the dam. Did I correctly interpret what you wrote?
Yes.
So on this work site, which included, apparently to what you were told, the labor of thousands of people, there were armed soldiers. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, do you recall being told during your visit about whether people in cooperatives were free to leave the cooperatives?
No, we were not told that they were free to leave cooperatives.
Were you told anything about a system about controlling the movement that you recall?
Because I would go out without their permission, they did talk about, when they told me to go back, they talked about security considerations and the requirement to have permission to leave.
I have just one moment. Yeah. Thank you. I'll move on at this time. It was mentioned yesterday that there were requests to see Sihanouk, and those were denied, correct?
Yes.
Did anyone indicate to you where Sihanouk was?
That he was occupied. He was busy.
It was also mentioned that you had asked to see Hu Nim and Hu Yuan. What was the response, as best you recall, to your request to see them, these fellow three ghosts along with Q Sampan?
The request was ignored.
like to go back for a moment to the interview you gave with Ing Sari, since we were just talking about the cooperatives, something actually I should have probably covered yesterday, but if the witness could be given that copy of her interview with Ing Sari. I believe she has it. If you go to the last page of that document, on the last page, and this is, Your Honors, E3/94, it's at ERN in English 0034 2504. In Khmer, the ERN is 00578899, and in French 00602002. You asked a question, this was your system of justice. And the answer from Ing Sari, according to these notes, was, in 1975, at the evacuation of cities, town, we didn't separate the people by base or network, but there was confusion. In 1976, then we began to divide the people. There was great confusion in 1976. Even people who were base people for a long time were accused of being agents. The first to divide people in categories were Sopim and Nimros. It was not ordered from the top to the bottom. Pol Pot didn't order the division into categories. Later on, in a meeting of leadership in 1976, this division was accepted by the leadership. Collectively, it was decided. 2 or 3 opposed it, but we didn't want a split. As chairman, Pol Pot summed it up collectively. At that time, we divided it up. 1, people of the base. 2, poor people from the cities. 3, people who supported Lon Nol. Would you recall Ing Sari giving you that answer?
Yes.
Now, in your interviews with refugees during the time of Democratic Kampuchea, since the fall of Democratic Kampuchea, with those who lived through the regime, have you learned about a division of individuals by the regime into categories?
Yes.
Did Ing Sari or anyone, so first of all, did anyone else on your trip discuss with you this division into categories?
Yes, we talked about generally in a sort of non-ideological way. We always talked about old people, new people, people from the city, going out to the collectives, the co-ops.
What was the difference when people are divided into categories? What was the purpose of that? Were they treated differently?
Yes, it was a system of privileges, and the new people were treated much more poorly than the old people in terms of the food, the amount of labor, support, all sorts of ways. It was a hierarchy.
Now, in classic Marxism, as I understand it, I'm not an expert, poor people from the cities, the proletariat, would be the base of a communist party. Why was it that poor people were listed in this list, if you know, behind base people? Why was it the fact that poor people were divided by whether they were from the countryside or from the cities?
Within this context, in the last years of the war, beginning with the U.S. bombing and then the intensification of the war between the Khmer Republic and the Khmer Rouge, the population of Phnom Penh doubled, tripled, so that the population of the city was not necessarily city dwellers. The city became a very mongrel version of itself, so that when you talk about people leaving the city, going into the countryside, you're talking often about people who were displaced from the rural areas during the war and then were only temporarily in the city. That would be the context.
Ms. Becker, as someone who was in Cambodia 1972 to 1974, you saw the influx of people from the countryside to the cities, to Phnom Penh, correct?
Yes.
And I presume that they came for a variety of reasons. Can you explain some of the reasons that people left their villages and came to Phnom Penh?
Well, as I said, the first huge infusion was because of the American bombing. It would be hard to exaggerate. The tonnage dropped, and the amount of villages destroyed, land destroyed. So the first part of, until the bombing ended in August 15th, 1973, there's little doubt that most of those refugees came fleeing the bombing, fleeing the destruction. And in most of our interviews with the refugees, they talked about the bombing. They talked about they had no place to go. They didn't know where they would be safe except in the city.
Now, at some point, you mentioned the bombing ended. The refugees, did they continue to come? The American bombing ended, I should clarify.
Well, there wasn't much bombing other than the Americans. The Khmer Republic had a very small Air Force, and what they did was nothing compared. Yes, and this had to do with the country was being severely divided by the armies, and the Cambodians were fleeing into the city for supplies. There was a beginning of refugees fleeing Khmer Rouge zones, and there was clear division. This is when we were beginning to get a sense of the difference in the Khmer Rouge zones. But some were fleeing the Khmer Rouge zones, some were finding relatives, and but the majority were simply fleeing fighting. There was a considerable lack of political understanding about what this war was about, not taking sides, just simply avoiding the fighting.
You mentioned some of these people fleeing Khmer Rouge zones. Did any of them discuss why they fled the Khmer Rouge zones?
The testimony that was the most complete and convincing on this was a book by a man named It Sarin called Regrets of the Khmer Soul. And this was published 72, 73 probably, and very popular in the city. It showed Cambodia's map with the Mekong making a broken heart. He was, I think, a school inspector. And we discussed it in my interview with Ying Turit. I wrote a big piece about it. It was the first almost diary-like discussion of what was going on in the Khmer Rouge zone, the lack of rights, the hard work, and at the same time, a respect that that the peasants weren't going to be cheated the way they were cheated with the old system. But this is one of the first times where you had the notion of the pineapple with the eyes can see everything. So it was the first sense of the authoritarian police state nature of the zones with some of the corresponding attraction vis-a-vis the corruption of the Khmer Republic. And that was a lot of what it was, that you didn't want to join the authoritarian nature of the zones. But again, this was one of the best sophisticated documents open to the public. When you did discuss it with the refugees, the lack of a political basis for fleeing was notable. It was simply fleeing the fighting.
Before the fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge in April 1975, did the Khmer Rouge and the Funk Grunk forces broadcast over the radio appeals to the people of Phnom Penh? Do you recall that or not?
Yes.
What, if anything, did they ask the people of Phnom Penh to do?
Are you talking about just before April 75?
During the war, before April 75, anytime. And if you're not sure, that's fine.
The reason I asked is they regularly broadcast appeals, and generally the tenor is rise up against the Khmer Republic. The earliest appeals were in the name of Prince Sihanouk, and they were very effective. Prince Sihanouk asking the people, particularly in the rural areas, to support the front worked very well. And this was an ongoing appeals all throughout the war.
Did they ask the people of Phnom Penh to leave Phnom Penh?
I don't know.
Thank you. You've just mentioned at the time, you mentioned Norodom Sihanouk at the time, Prince. I would like to now ask you some questions about the late King, Norodom Sihanouk. As a person who was a journalist covering an author writing about Cambodia, have you studied the remarkable life of Norodom Sihanouk?
Yes.
Have you ever seen him in person?
Yes.
Can you describe your contacts with King Norodom Sihanouk?
After January 1979, when I first met him, I interviewed him multiple times in the United States during that period in the 80s when he was when he was a member of the coalition, the DK coalition, against the Vietnamese occupation. And I wrote articles about our interviews. And then I saw him briefly here in Phnom Penh after he returned, after the United Nations brokered peace agreement and elections.
Thank you. I'd like to read a few passages from your book about King Sihanouk and then ask you for your comments or clarifications. And this again is from E320, When the War Was Over. The first passage is English ERN 00238146. It's page 433. In French, 00638681 at page 422. And in Khmer, it's at 00232570, continuing on to the next page. And that's at page 572 to 573. You wrote, just 2 days before the Vietnamese captured Phnom Penh, Prince Norodom Sihanouk was freed from house arrest, apparently at the strong insistence of the Chinese. Sihanouk, with his wife Monique and what remained of his family and some friends, was first taken to meet Pol Pot, who told him, "It's time for you to help us in the diplomatic field. We are in great difficulty." Without hesitation, Sihanouk agreed to help and went on to Beijing. There he held a record-breaking 6-hour news conference. He spoke of his 3 years of house arrest, sleeping no more than 3 hours each night, pacing the rooms of a small apartment inside the royal palace, cooking his own meals, and listening to foreign broadcasts over the radio. Sihanouk and his entourage saw no one but Khieu Samphan during the first 2 years. During the final year, 1978, Sihanouk was taken around the countryside each month to lift up the spirits of the peasants in preparation for the coming Vietnamese invasion. So my first question is, who held King Sihanouk under house arrest for 3 years?
The government leaders of Democratic Kampuchea.
Now you also write about the 1975 United Nations General Assembly. And you do this at page 205 and 206 of your book. In English, the ERN is 00237910, continuing to the next page. In French, 00638469, page 207 and 208. And in Khmer, 00232273. And that's pages 275 and 276. You wrote that following in the footsteps of Ieng Sary, who had arrived earlier as Cambodia's new foreign minister, Sihanouk performed well. He knowingly repeated the lies Ieng Sary had told the UN, and that the evacuation had been carried out without bloodshed, that the refugee reports of wholesale executions were unfounded, and the revolution was self-reliant, in no need of aid from abroad. And then going on to the next page, he wrote, his mission fulfilled, Sihanouk departed New York and announced he would make an 11-country tour to places like Albania, Somalia, and the Yemen Arab Republic before returning to Cambodia. The Cambodians who had served Sihanouk in Beijing during his war years in exile decided to quit. Privately, the prince had warned them of the dangers they would face, and they defected to France. In Paris, they contradicted everything the prince had said at the UN about the Khmer Rouge. They said the new revolutionaries had thrown out the liberal program promised during the war, and they feared the refugee stories were true, and they were afraid to go back to Phnom Penh. Is that correct, that you wrote this about Prince Sihanouk?
Yes.
Before I ask you some details about this, I want to read on to another section, and this is at page 445 in English, ERN 00238158, and in Khmer 00232579. You wrote, his wife, Princess Monique, said simply she would never go back to Cambodia. The next morning, the prince woke up panicked by the chains that international diplomacy had thrown around him. In an uncharacteristically clumsy gesture, he passed a note to Andrew Young, the U.S. ambassador at the United Nations, pleading for political exile. Ambassador Young immediately consulted his superiors at the State Department in Washington, and on their orders arranged for the prince to be admitted to the Lenox Hill Hospital. There, Young told Sihanouk it would be a mistake for him to choose exile. Richard Holbrooke, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, said, we told them that he would lose his standing as an independent leader if he chose exile in the United States. Now, at the time, did you learn about this incident where Prince Sihanouk, at the time Prince Sihanouk, first spoke at the United Nations, speaking favorably about the Khmer Rouge, repeating a speech, many of the words of Ieng Sary, and then later sought asylum?
How did I know? It was public knowledge.
Okay.
And just reporting.
Do you know who wrote the speech that Prince Sihanouk read or gave to the United Nations General Assembly then in January of 1979?
No.
At the time, do you know how many children or grandchildren Prince Sihanouk had? Did he have children or grandchildren?
Yes.
Do you know if any of his children, grandchildren, or other family were inside democratic Kampuchea at the time that Prince Sihanouk went to New York and spoke at the General Assembly?
Yes.
At the time that Prince Sihanouk was in New York and spoke at the General Assembly, do you know if he was aware whether or not his children and grandchildren were still alive? Or all of them were alive or dead?
At the dinner that I quote, where I'm talking to Prince Sihanouk and Princess Monique, he mentioned family in Cambodia, but we did not go into detail.
Did you later learn, well, during the time just before he came to New York, he had told you, and you wrote, is this correct? Do I understand correctly? He was under house arrest and isolated, and basically the only outlet he had to the outside world was a radio and Q Sampan.
Yes.
Did you later learn about how many children and grandchildren of Norodom Sihanouk were killed during the DK regime?
Yes, I learned that some were killed.
You later wrote in the book at page 478, the English ERN is 00238191, and in Khmer it's 00232618 at page 620. And for some reason there is not a French translation, although it has been requested. You wrote, in a lengthy written interview, Sihanouk said he realized the Vietnamese were withdrawing from Cambodia, and he believed that another Khmer Rouge Holocaust is becoming inevitable. Let me add another point you wrote on the next page. You quote Sihanouk as saying, "What does it mean if you demand that the Vietnamese troops withdraw, but allow the genocidal Pol Pot clique the possibility of returning to masses if you allow," let me start that all over. "But what does it mean if you demand that the Vietnamese troops withdraw, but allow the genocidal Pol Pot clique the possibility of returning to massacre the Cambodian people again?" When you spoke to Prince Sihanouk in the 1980s, did he explain to you his view about the human rights record, about how the Khmer Rouge treated the people of Cambodia?
Yes.
And what would he say about the Khmer Rouge?
He was inconsistent. He would sometimes talk about the genocidal regime, as in this quote, and at other times he would talk about the necessity of working with them.
Well, are those two inconsistent? Did Prince Sihanouk in the 1980s ever deny the human rights abuses, the killings of the Khmer Rouge?
Not that I remember.
To another topic, and very briefly touch on this issue of Vietnamese victims of the Khmer Rouge. You wrote on page 242, the English ERN 00237947, at page 242, in French 00638502 at page 222, and in Khmer 00232320 at page 322. There was also a new directive in the middle of 1977 to kill off a new category of enemy people of Vietnamese ancestry. By this time, Sissofa had learned to hide her Kampuchea Krom family history. Quote, "They started killing people with any Vietnamese blood, even Kampuchea Krom," unquote. Can you tell us, first of all, who was Sissofa?
She was a member of the May family, one of the families that I chronicle in the book to give a human face to what went on.
And did you interview her on one occasion, on more than one occasion?
Many occasions.
Was she, if I understand from the passage, a Kampuchea Krom descent?
Yes.
Was she born in Cambodia?
I believe so, yes. I can't remember right, but I think she was.
I want to move on and discuss with you the Chams. You lived in Cambodia 72 to 74. You've been back many times since. What can you tell us briefly about the Cham people in Cambodia?
The Chams are the Muslim minority, and there's a basic bias when I lived here in the 70s of one of those sort of racial biases of their Islam. They were criticized as being supposedly lazy and being exotic. There's the Muslim countries of the region, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, had a special interest in protecting them during the war. And then during democratic Kampuchea, they were targeted.
Are Chams visible in Cambodia? As you drive around the country or even Phnom Penh or go down the river, can you recognize a Cham?
Well, certainly by dress. The women wear scarves, the men are in different clothes, and their communities tend to look differently. If, for the most obvious reason, they have mosques.
And do they have headwear that's different?
Yes, the women are scarved, and the men have those hats.
Many of the men have beards.
Yes.
You wrote on page 251 of your book, in English, the ERN is 0023 7956. In French, it's 0063 8511, and in Khmer 0023 2332. The Khmer Rouge policy of eliminating ethnic differences and creating a new race had the greatest effect on the Muslim Chams. These exotic people were twice doomed for their foreign race and their reactionary, that's in quotes, faith. For generations, they had avoided being absorbed into the society of Buddhist Khmer. And then on page 252, the next page in all of ERNs, they were considered the best and most ferocious fighters in Cambodia. The majority of Chams joined the Khmer Rouge and were among their ranks until 1973. When, with the inauguration of the cooperatives, the communists declared the Chams' distinct lifestyle counter-revolutionary. You go on to write, after the Khmer Rouge victory, the attack against the Chams became open and systematic. The religious and community leaders of the Chams were hunted down and murdered. Mosques were destroyed or desecrated, used like pagodas as granaries, pigsties, or prisons. Copies of the Islamic religious book, the Quran, were destroyed. Cham schools were shut down, as were all schools. And then Let me perhaps read all of these before asking you questions. On page 250 to 251, excuse me. So it's the same page that I was reading. The rules that all Cambodians had to follow after the revolution had even more devastating consequences on the Chams, forcing them to choose their faith and identity or the revolution and their lives. They had to drop their family and given names and choose Khmer names. To look Khmer, they had to cut their hair, shave their beards, and wear clothes that further robbed them of their identity. They were forced to eat pork at gunpoint as a test, and their families too were broken up, preventing the adults from passing on to their children or to the children who were sent to dormitories with Khmer children or on mobile youth brigades. And finally, but the Chams rebelled. Whole Cham villages took up arms against the Khmer Rouge, and whole villages were in turn slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge. Even villages that did not openly protest were massacred by zealous cadre. And none of the Cham villages were allowed to remain intact. Chams were dispersed to predominantly Khmer cooperatives and forced to integrate. In some cooperatives, Chams were forced to eat pork, forbidden in Islam, and were not allowed to speak their language or practice their faith. How many, in your research, did you speak to Chams?
President, Madam Expert, please wait, and Councillor Coupe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Although I find it a very fascinating, interesting subject, there's much to be said about this subject. But I also do remember the email the senior legal officer wrote to us with 5 topics that we should be concentrating on. The treatment of the Cham is definitely not as mentioned as a topic in that email. So I'm just wondering, I have no problem in itself with this line of questioning, but is there any meaning as to the content of that email, or is it just a suggestion from you?
President. I'd like to hand the floor to Judge Friends to clarify this issue to the parties. Judge Friends, you have the floor.
The reason for the email was obviously to avoid this expert to be on the stand for a couple of weeks. Now, undeniably, the issue of the charm is part of case 022. So in order to balance those two facts, we would suggest, as the email said, not to focus on this issue. So the question is, how many more questions to this topic does the prosecution envisage?
I can finish this topic in 5 minutes or less.
In this case, generally, we suggest for parties to keep these two issues in balance with further questioning. Please go ahead.
I noticed the international lit co-lawyer is on her feet. Do you have the floor?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be very quick here. Among the 5 points in the email that was sent to us, there are the CPK policies with regard to specific groups, and we had the impression that among these specific groups, the issues of the charm could be included. So I just simply wanted to provide this contextual information to you because as far as we are concerned, the charm were among the 5 points that you asked us to work on in view of our questioning of the expert here present today.
Thank you for your observation, Counsel. It is now appropriate for a short break. We will take a break now and return at 10:30 to resume our proceedings. And court officer, please assist the expert during the break and have her return into the courtroom at 10:30. The court is now in recess.